Alex here from Black Sheep IT Consulting. Here today we are looking at an integration workspace that I created. As you can see, it's under the int UAT workspace, which represents my example integration or user acceptance test environment. And I have a project workspace underneath here, which I called ADM Demo. And in this workspace, I have already delivered several developments, starting with a dummy development just to get it kicked off. I activated a workflow process. And then in the second development workspace, I created a filter service, a business service that allows me to modify requests and responses for outbound REST requests. And as you can see by the list of objects here, I also created a outbound proxy business service and the adjacent integration objects for Swagger Pet Store. If you're not familiar with Swagger Pet Store, go to petstore.swagger.io, and that's a free demo environment by the people who literally built Swagger. And Pet Store is very popular, and it provides us with a JSON file that I have imported into WebTools, into the wizard, and it has generated the respective proxy business service, Swagger Pet Store, and the integration object. So there's a bunch of stuff I developed in this second development workspace. And the third one was actually delivered a while ago. No, it's still just created. So here's another one. That's an update to that filter service. So when you import a Swagger or OpenAPI file, you get a business service and you get integration object, but you also get, and that's the point of the whole demo, you also get an outbound REST service definition, which I pulled up here, which is automatically generated by the WebTools wizard and placed here in this administrative set of tables. So you have that outbound REST services view, you can find it. And I made a modification to the getOrderByID method in that I associated my request filter service with a request filter method and the same service with a different method as the response filter. So request and response filter methods allow us to inspect and inject something into the input or output property set as the request passes out to the external service. That's the request filter, and when it comes back, the response filter method will be called. So I'm not going into details of the implementation of that actual service. It's just that we have something that has been added to the standard, let's put it that way, REST, outbound REST service definition in terms of customization. There's a custom business service, there's now a dependency on that custom business service, which of course is in the repository. So this data, however, is not in the repository, it's administrative. And the big question for today is, how do we migrate it? How do we use the migration application to get all the objects, the repository objects and the administrative data from development to my test environment? So of course you could say, well, here's an export button waiting for us to export that, but we want to use the migration application, and the migration application allows us to set up plans, migration plans, and in a migration plan we can of course do an incremental runtime repository export. That's not the problem, to get all the repository objects. But how do we get the administrative data objects? So we have basically two ways. We could use the application data service, but that is very much table oriented. So we would have to deal with a lot of tables, probably 3 or more, because there are intersection tables involved maybe. And then we also have the option of using application deployment manager projects, which is my preferred way of exporting hierarchical data. And if you look at the data again, it's very much hierarchical. So there's a parent record, there are child records, and for each child record, there's this filter option, filters list. So, and well, it's great that we have an export button. We can use that and see how does vanilla Siebel export that stuff, because ADM will simply also export it to an XML file based on an integration object. Let's see what happens here when we export this. So I get an XML file and I have opened it already here. And I can see from the header, it's a perfect Siebel message header. So it must be an integration object behind it. And the next line literally tells me which is the integration object. Okay, REST web service. That's great. And I can confirm that this has all the aspects of the service exported. So there is the REST web service itself, and within the REST web service it has a list of operations, and it has a list of ports. So somewhere in here there must be my custom business service. And there it is. So it's here in the list of REST operations for a specific method, the get order by ID. So I can clearly see that the data is exported just fine. I could, of course, take that XML file, log into the test or production environment and import that XML file. But probably want to make sure that this business service has arrived first, right? So the dependency, you remember? So export import manually is not the tool of choice we want, but we get some nice insight here. There is actually an integration object which represents all the data we would probably want to export and import. So we could reuse that integration object. That's a good idea, reusing stuff. So to create an actual project in ADM, we would have to go to the Application Deployment Manager screen. And let's check out the first view, the data type details, because that's a list of all the content objects that are represented here as a data type. And content objects are quite special objects. They're not actually integration objects. They are a wrapper for an integration object, plus a view where users using ADM screens can check the filters. So that's pretty cool, and you will see it in a few minutes. So we can only see the content objects here and not the integration objects represented. But let's do a quick search for something like REST. Maybe we're not lucky here, right? Let's search REST again. And there seems to be no vanilla data type for the outbound REST services, which is understandable because ADM is fairly old and REST is fairly new. So it's very likely that Oracle has never produced a vanilla data type that is a vanilla content object. We can, of course, check in Siebel Tools or Web Tools. If we go to the content object, and it's not shown here, so make sure you expand your Object Explorer to display the content objects. Also make sure integration object is shown. And now if we go to content object, we can search for that integration object. So you see a content object is basically pointing at a business object and an integration object that represents the data. And if you look careful, there's also a child object, the content object view. So for each content object, there's one view which is then used in the ADM screens, or by a link in the ADM screens rather. So let's see if our REST web service integration object, the one we identified as being very good for handling that kind of data, is actually used here. And as we expected, there is no content object for this integration object. So one of the first moves ahead to automating the migration of outbound REST services with customizations and including the administrative data would be to create that content object here and then use the ADM screen to create the data type. So let's start with identifying the important information. So we need to go back to that view, outbound REST services, and let's identify the business object. So the business object is web service, okay. And then we have business components, which are already represented by that integration object. So we need the business object, integration object, and the view name, which we can just grab from here. So, okay. So now let's create a workspace under our demo workspace. Let's just call it 04 and call it content object. Okay, so now we can proceed and create our content object, and let's call it using a custom prefix. Let's just call it like the integration object. So BCRM REST web service. We have to put in a project, pick any project, and the business service name. Yeah, to get that again, probably it was web service, and now the integration object, which is, let's use the pick list to make sure we pick the right one. So we have that integration object mapped to a new content object definition. Now we need to take care of the content object view, and then again we just pick the view name from here. This is a good view to use. You will see shortly how these views comes into play, and that's the view name. So make sure it's picked from the list. Okay, looking good here. I noticed, and you notice too, that when you go for help about view in this view, it's actually a Neo object. So for this to work, it has to be actually part of the repository. So you might have to run a repository upgrade to get that view definition. I'm not sure. It could be the case for some of the more system-related views that you're working with in this area, that they are not in the repository, not visible in the repository, because they are non-extensible objects which are defined in a DLL file. But recently Oracle has added a lot of these Neo objects to the standard repository through the repository upgrade. So you must run that repository upgrade first. Let's verify. I'm pretty sure the view is there. I can drill down on it, and the view really exists. Yes, that's a view, all right. And also that view must be within your administrative user's responsibility for the entire thing to work. So just a few notes about that content object view. Okay, so there's my content object. And now I'm going out on a limb. I just want to try if I can use that content object in the context of my workspace. So I'm not delivering. I haven't delivered. And I will inspect the workspace using our DevPops, allowing me to do a fast inspect. And let's go back to that Application Deployment Manager data type details view and try to create a new content object. So let's call it like so. And now if we open the list, can we actually see it here, or do we have to deliver it? Now we can find it. So that's great. So that is one benefit of the workspace enabled objects, which include content objects. To be honest, I never tried that before. I was just curious if it works, and it seems to work. So we have a data type created. Of course, you can first deliver your content object and then do the same steps. So now we have a new data type with a content object which points to an integration object and a view, and we can put it to a first test. So for that, we have to create a deployment project based on that data type. So let's create a new deployment project, BCRM REST Web Service. Make sure to remember that name well. You will have to create the same project with the same name in the target environment. And to use it with the migration application, check export to file. Session configurable is, especially when you're goofing around, it's pretty handy. So let's set it to and save that. And now we need at least one project item, which will be our BCRM REST Web Service definition. The deployment mode is a little bit weird. There's a tiny little bug with the translation of the LOVs, but I'm going to use the English synchronize. And now it's the deployment filter we need to set. So the name we're looking for is Swagger Pet Store. So let's check out that. Sorry for that. Let's check out that integration object. That's the integration object used, and it has, of course, integration components such as REST Web Service, which is the parent. And in that parent, we want to use the name as a search spec. So let's check out, there's a name field, all right. So we can use the dot notation, which is recommended. So we have that business component name. And so I use it in the deployment filter, business component name dot field name, which is name. And the one I want to export is Swagger Pet Store. Okay. You could also set up a PDQ in the target view and use the PDQ if you have that, but we don't. If you validate the filter, it should give you no error message, so that looks okay right now, but the real validation is, and now the view comes into the picture. When you drill down on that data type name, it will use that deployment filter and open the target view. Voila. So now you can check, okay, that really exists. Because the filter could be fine, but not return any data. I think it will prompt you, but not sure. Or if you might have a typo, whatever. So, okay, so that is a valid filter. So we have, and let's give it a try. Sometimes you can run it without the dot notation. I noticed that in some occasions. Let's just try that one here. And seems to work as well. Can't put my finger on it. It's fine. So it probably goes through the parent first, whatever it finds first. I'm just speculating here. So that's a fine project we can use. So let's enable it. We still haven't exported one thing, so we have to create a folder. Here I have my temp folder. Let's create a new folder in the temp for ADM. I'm using the Siebel server temp folder because that's always accessible. So we have enabled that project. It's now read-only. So we have to go to deployment sessions. And of course, the final version would be we use it through the migration application. But of course, it's good to test the baby steps so that your project really works, your integration object, your content object, integration object, is all working before you use it in the migration application. So now we can pick the project, save it once, Control S, so you get the session transactions list populated here, and you can click deploy and specify that path must be reachable from that machine where you run it. and there was no real message about that, so all seems to have gone well. And there's our XML file, the big one, without DES. DES is description. The big one, the other file, is the one which carries the data and which is imported to be imported on the other side. So let's open it just to check. There's a little bit of more information around an ADM message, but it's essentially contains the same information as the Siebel message we've seen before. So let's search for our custom business service. And that's here. The BCRM REST filter service is represented here as well. So when I import that into an environment where it has not been imported before, it will hopefully create all these records and associate them correctly with the business service. So the problem here you can see clearly is the dependency on the business service, where there's a pick list, and you would get a pick list error if that business service doesn't exist in the target environment. So so there's literally only one way to find out, is to run the migration into the target environment. Now, of course, the target environment needs to have the necessary information, which is the content object, the ADM data type, and the ADM project setup. So let's fast forward a little bit. So to first illustrate the problem is that I'm now in the target environment, which is an RR environment. So just to make sure pretty clear, there is no Swagger pet store outbound REST service definition. Okay, so I've exported it from dev, so I can import it here. So I can choose the file, and there it is. That's the file I just exported on the other side. And when I try to import that, it's pretty clear it doesn't work. The value entered in response filter service of buscomp REST operation does not match any value in the bounded pick list SRF service. So it failed to import because that business service, the custom business service, does not yet exist in this environment. So that was a manual import attempt, but any ADM import would also fail at the same time. So now let's prepare for this environment for ADM. We have to do this manually. We have to go to the ADM. Actually, we can't. So we have to migrate the repository content first. So to do that, I have created a watermark using the watermark icon here, because that's a real RR environment. I can create a watermark, and I've already uploaded that watermark to my temporary folder. Here it is. So that's the watermark created. And now let's use this watermark to extract the new content and do an incremental migration into RR to have the content object and the business service and everything in there. So what's the status in my dev environment? I have delivered everything, including the content object, to my ADM demo integration workspace, and my RR environment is running on int UAT. So I have to do one more delivery. So I'm submitting that one integration, the project workspace, if you will, and I'm delivering it right now. So that is the ADM demo 01. Let's deliver that. That will create a new version of that int UAT workspace, a version which supersedes the version which I have deployed or migrated to the RR previously. So an incremental migration will pick up, hopefully, all these changes. We'll see in a few moments. Okay, so the import is complete. The delivery is complete. So now let's get back to the migration application on dev. Do we have a migration plan? No. So let's create one for incremental runtime repository with def as the source, and we pick the incremental runtime repository data service. A schema service is enforced. We don't have any LOVs or application workspace data service at that moment. And yeah, we also have, let's refresh that for a moment. We should see the ADM project popping up. After refresh it does, because we have enabled it on this. So we don't use that ADM project right now. We're just exporting the repository data to have the necessary background in the target environment to actually use that ADM content object, which we will now transport, and then we have to create that project on the other side, and then we will be able to synchronize the REST web service definitions. So it's a bit of a trek here. So let's save that. Could not create a migration plan because, okay, let's check. Okay, I had to log out and log in again. That was the problem with probably the data was not synchronized. So now I can create and save my incremental RR migration plan and go to the execution tab and run it. And of course it asks for a name of the zip file to be created. So let's call this incremental RR and give it today's date. And call it version 1, and the watermark file to use. Of course, we have to make sure that watermark file is actually in the shared folder, which in my case is the migration folder. So here I'm in the migration folder of the dev environment. I've copied over that watermark file. It's an asynchronous migration, and let's copy that file name. And now getting the workspace details will consume the file, will tell us, okay, it's all about that integration workspace, and there's only one version higher than the version that's already migrated. So version 2 will be exported, which is fine. So let's run this. And those incremental migrations are usually super fast, especially if the schema service comes back with no schema changes detected and not applicable. So it only takes a few minutes or even less than a minute sometimes to complete, like now. And so in the history, we just make sure it was a successful run, and we should now have a zip file. There it is, containing all these repository changes that we exported. And I'm going to move that zip file to my temporary location where I can pick it up on the other side. Copy that over here. And here we are on the other side where we can pick up the zip file and put it into the file system migration folder on the target environment. So again, this is an asynchronous migration. Synchronous migration would already be complete by now. So all we need now is the migration, a migration plan for an incremental import into the UAT environment, and we pick the incremental runtime repository data service, saved plan, and now we can run the plan, and it prompts us for the file name, which we can copy over here. Also prompts for the database information. There is nothing to do in the database, but you still have to fill in that password. And okay, let's run it. So clicking on any of these action links will get us the status. And since it's only literally 2 steps left to run, it will be pretty fast. And it's completed already, so that's nice. There's one thing that we have to also keep in mind. This is an environment running on an integration workspace. So it's a typical test scenario. And that integration workspace name is int UAT, but in the target environment it becomes the main workspace. So it should be fine with all the object managers running on main, picking it up immediately. There's EI object manager involved with the migration, which also needs to pick up things and does that slightly slower, as I've noticed. But usually that by the time you're ready to run the migration, it's all good. So let's log in fresh to a session on Siebel Call Center on the target environment. So if we check out the workspace dashboard, we have an incremental version 1 of the main workspace here. We don't see any insert updates because that's hidden. It's not design repository data, it's runtime, and you can't see that runtime repository data here, but that's fine. So now we should be able to create that ADM project. So go to Application Deployment Manager. We need to register the data type because it's a custom data type. And you might ask yourself, okay, can we automate this? And probably you can. ADM Data Types is not sure if ADM Data Type is a vanilla data type, but if it's not, you could create one, but that would be like chicken and egg. So I just create it manually here, making sure it's exactly the same name as in the other environment. So here I'm in the dev environment. Just make sure I copy that data type name. And here I'm in the target environment. Let's query for it first. So we're 100% sure it does not exist. Let's create it. And now we should be able to pick that custom content object because it has been just migrated a few minutes ago. That's all right. Okay, so make sure you have the same data type definition in each environment. And then we also need a deployment project with the same configuration, same name in each of the environments. So again, we copy stuff from the source environment just to make 100% sure we have the same settings here. And here we are in the target. Let's just query for the project first to just make sure or prove there's no such project. Let's create that project with the same configuration. And set it to synchronize as well. I'm not sure. We probably don't need a filter here because it's used for import only. So let's try without a filter and enable it. So it of course must be enabled. You don't need to run any sessions because you're going to automate this through migration application. But if you want to test if it works, and we are here to learn things and test things, let's try to use a deployment session to import. In ADM, in the Application Deployment Manager screen, if you actually want to import stuff, you don't actually create a session. The sessions are just for export. If you want to import, first you need the exported XML file, and then you run a deploy from file or deploy from local file. Local file is most easier most of the times because you can just pick from your local machine and it will upload it to the server. So here I pick that XML file that I have produced through running ADM on the dev environment and just want to test if it gets the same error message as I would expect. Well, actually now it wouldn't, so let's stop here. Let's not import that. because the business service is already here. So it would import, and I don't want to spoil my environment here. So let's not do it, but that's the way you would test it. Maybe test with another one and see, okay, does the ADM import work? So that's how you run a session. I'm canceling here for the reason I explained. And now we have the ADM project on both sides. Let's just verify again. We have the content object on both sides. We have the repository metadata on both sides. So we're ready to migrate that REST web service definition using the migration application. So we are back on the development side, a development environment, and just to make double sure, we can use the ADM projects. Hit the refresh button one more time, and it will refresh your list of enabled ADM projects. If you get into trouble with that, maybe if it's the first time you do it, log out and log in again. And now let's create a migration plan for ADM export. It's of course an asynchronous plan since we don't have environments that can be synchronously used. So we export first and then we import. And now, of course, we don't use any of the metadata and file services. We use the deployment manager projects. And there's a sequence number in case you use more projects. For example, you have some dependencies. You want to make sure that something is imported first. It's actually mostly relevant for the import. Import something first and then import something second. I put a 1 in here. Doesn't matter because I don't use the other project I have. Okay, let's save that. So that would actually run ADM export on that machine, and in the zip file we should find the XML. So let's make sure that happens. So if I run that ADM export plan, I get a file. Let's call it ADM, and let's put today's date. First try. Okay, and that runs, and it's literally exporting and packaging it. So it's running. There's a log file. Let's check. There's no log file yet, but let's give it a few seconds to breathe. So eventually execution has completed. Let's click OK here. Let's go history. Yes, was a success. And there's a log file for the ADM export. Yep, okay. That worked just fine. Export completed. So we should have a zip file right now. And there it is. Yep. Let's open that one. And there's an ADM folder. And here's the ADM stuff where we're looking for. So that's the exported REST web service. So let's check out the file. And content is as we expected, including, let's test one final time, the filter service reference. Okay, so next step would be to, as we'll do in a few moments, copy over that zip and import in the target environment. Before we go over to the RR environment and do our import, let's take a look at some important settings you might want to consider. So if you look at the log files here, there's AI Object Manager involved, obviously, because migration application. And then ADM specifically requires workflows, and those are executed by the Workflow Process Manager in case you use the migration application to do so. So that invokes the Workflow Process Manager, runs the workflow processes, etc. So it's important to have those in, especially workflow component group enabled on your servers. on both environments. And since there is a lot of writing of XML files and so forth, take a look at the EAI transport folders enterprise parameter, which must carry in a semicolon separated list all the locations where it is okay to write, where any EAI business service, etc., will write files. And that must include, as I highlight here, the path to the migration shared folder, which in my case is the Siebel file system migration folder on that environment. So make sure you have that set up. And then another thing is important, that if you consider the environment I'm having, where we have, if you look at the workspace explorer or workspace dashboard, we're clearly inside an integration workspace with custom objects that are required, like the content object I've created. And that is not in main yet. That has not been delivered yet because we're still in testing phase. So your workflow process manager and EI object manager must run on this integration workspace on the development environment. So to do so, you probably know where this is leading up to, is setting the workspace branch name parameter. Let's check it out, for example, for the workflow process manager where I set it. And there's the workspace branch name, which I set to the name of the integration workspace where all the objects are, so that the workflows running inside this component can actually find the content object we talk about, etc. So 3 things to consider. First, the workspace branch name, the EAI file, transport folders, and having your components, your component groups enabled, workflow especially. Okay, so with that, let's head over to the target environment. So here we are on the target environment, and we first need a migration plan. So you can reuse migration plans, but in this case we have none which handles the project. And before we go there, let me quickly cancel out of here. Let's make sure we refresh the connection to get the deployment manager projects. So as you can see, in my case, I've done a slight change and renamed the project. So I make sure that the new project name, BCRM REST Web Service 2, shows up here, so I can start using it in the migration plans. When you do that kind of refresh, you sometimes have to log out and log in. You notice when you can't save the migration plan immediately, and just re-log in and it should be fine. So now the UAT environment is the target, so that's the ADM import plan. And now I can choose the project, and it's only one project, but let's add that number and save it. So it can be used for import now. And let's run that import. So I have made sure that the zip file is copied over. There it is. So I have the zip file name. I can run the ADM import with that zip file, and let's just see what happens. So it starts off. It's running. Is there a log file already? Okay. Starting import. Well, import complete successfully. That's a nice one. Okay, that means we are now in history, and successfully so. So let's check that out. So what did we get? Did we get a deployment session? Actually not. There's no session indicating that anything happened, like the ADM import doesn't actually require such a session record. So now we shall navigate to the administration web services, outbound REST services view, and now the Outbound REST service definition is there with all the methods, and one of the methods, get order by ID, has the references, as we can see here clearly, to the custom business service, because that custom business service was migrated before the ADM plan run. So when you do this in real life, make sure to establish all your custom objects, business services, content objects first. Then maybe you have to create ADM projects, and then you're ready to synchronize or run ADM migration plans and, well, synchronize your environments with any data that can be literally represented by integration objects, which is mostly hierarchical data, but includes any custom and administrative data that you like, of course, except the workspace managed administrative data, which at the time of this recording is a list of values. So thanks for watching, take care, and bye-bye.